ground invasion into the Gaza Strip. The death toll in the war has risen to 3,200 by Friday, including 1,900 in Gaza and 1,300 in Israel.
We are striking at our enemies with unprecedented might. I emphasize, this is just the beginning. Our enemies have only begun paying the price, and I won't detail what is yet to come, but I tell you that this is only the beginning.
In a statement Friday, the Israeli military said they carried out small raids into Gaza. For the first time in this war, ground troops are operating inside Gaza, fighting terrorists and searching for evidence about the missing hostages held by Hamas. But this is not yet the beginning of the major ground invasion. Israel on Friday asked residents living in the northern part of Gaza to flee south before the beginning of Saturday. The evacuation order covers over 1 million people, or roughly half of Gaza's population. The United Nations said,
"We consider it is impossible for such a movement to take place without devastating humanitarian consequences, and we strongly appeal for any such order to be rescinded, avoiding what could transform what is already a tragedy into a calamitous situation."
Israel says the evacuation order is to minimize harm to civilians, as Hamas is known to use human shields. The terrorist organization asked Gaza residents to ignore the evacuation order and stay in their homes.
Temporary evacuation is reversible. Loss of human life is not. What we all hear is not the UN's concern for civilians. What we hear is the UN's indifference to the murder of 1,300 Israelis. The UN is making it clear that it doesn't want Israel to defend itself.
To the north of Israel, shelling occurred on Friday between the Israeli army and Hezbollah along the border with Lebanon. Reuters News said one of its videographers was killed during the exchange of fire. 6 other journalists were injured. Israel said it will investigate what happened. Reporting by Allison Lee, NTD News.
The Biden a possible ground invasion. Good evening to you as well. The White House today acknowledged that it would be, quote, a tall order for 1 million people to evacuate Gaza, which is already a combat zone. And President Biden, in the speech this afternoon, again vowed to stand with Israel while also noting a need to address a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Watch.
The United States, make no mistake about it, stands with Israel. It's also a priority for me to urgently address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The overwhelming majority of Palestinians had nothing to do with Hamas.
And as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is vowing to destroy Hamas, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is in Israel and telling Netanyahu that the U.S. is sending over munitions at the speed of war. He says now is not the time for neutrality. Watch.
Now, this is no time for neutrality or for false equivalence. Terrorists like Hamas deliberately target civilians, but democracies don't.
And when it comes to the hostage crisis right now, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is meeting with leaders in the Middle East to try to secure the release of the roughly 150 hostages now in Hamas' hands, which includes less than a handful of Americans. And President Biden today met virtually with the family members of the 14 Americans who are still missing. He says he promised to do everything he can to bring back every single American. Back to you.
We're hoping for the safe return of those Americans. And the Emmanuel Macron visited the school on Friday afternoon. Also, a staffer at the Israeli embassy in China was stabbed on the sidewalk in Beijing. Footage shows the diplomat being stabbed multiple times by a man in white. The attack came after Israel's foreign ministry expressed deep disappointment that Beijing didn't condemn Hamas's terrorist attack over the weekend. And lastly, as you can see here, around 500 protesters in the West Bank marched towards the Israeli border as part of the so-called Day of Rage. Another clip shows Lebanese police dispersing the crowd using tear gas. Other Palestinian supporters also rallied around the world today, and here in New York City, hundreds of people gathered in Times Square to make their voices heard. NTD's Jason Perry went to the event and talked to some people on the ground.
Tensions have been high since Saturday when Hamas terrorists crossed into Israeli territory and murdered over 1,300 people. That terrorist act sparked the war between Israel and Hamas. Since then, many have been vocal about their feelings for both sides in the war. Many people are gathering here in Times Square in New York City on Friday. A former Hamas leader called for action in support of Palestinians, and tens of thousands joined in protests in the Middle East and around the world. I spoke to some people here in Times Square to get a better understanding of how they feel about the situation.
The Palestinian, the people are different, and the political problems are one thing, but it's completely unacceptable to blockade a whole population, cut them off from electricity and water. The killing of innocent civilians is unacceptable. Killing of women and children is unacceptable, including those heinous acts carried by Hamas. But ultimately, they have a right to their freedom.
So now I'm not speaking about any organization, I'm speaking about the people who lost their houses, lost their land, lost their life, and they don't have the basic needs to live, even under the siege and after all this situation, they don't have the basic needs. So I don't know what's the solution, but the solution now, they have at least to stop killing them. I hope the people who are helping the other side, which is Israel, to stop, to at least go see the other side. Don't have only one source of information, check the other side and learn about it, or educate yourself about it.
Ukraine, as multiple conflicts in other parts of the world are escalating. How is this impacting American military readiness? We're joined by an international military strategist who tells us that his concern is not with the preparedness of U.S. military service members, but rather with the politics of their leadership. Darren Gobb, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Hey, thanks, Tiffany. Always good to see you. Thanks for having me on.
To begin, with this new war in the Middle East, the U.S. is still sending aid and arms to Ukraine. Now, the Pentagon has been warning Congress recently it's low on funds to resupply weapons in the States. Now, foreign policy experts are warning there could be a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. How ready is the U.S. military resources?
Well, Tiffany, I think resource-wise, materially, there are certainly some challenges that need to be investigated, mostly on the munitions side, because that's what we've been sending a lot of. And we've got lines of manufacturing that are inactive right now. There are some funding concerns in there, but I would say that the money is there in the overall budget. We spend plenty of money. We could actually prioritize this along with things like our southern border to do what we need to do. My biggest concern, though, right now when it comes to the military and its readiness is the chain of command that starts in the White House. The readiness and the ability to actually engage in a conflict and be able to be the leadership that this nation needs to win in such a conflict, should we choose to engage in it, doesn't exist. And so that is my greatest fear. Most of the people in the military will do their job, will do their mission, and they'll want to do it the best they can. But right now, they're not adequately led to give me any confidence.
I want to get to that, but on the point of munitions, how does the U.S. replenish that? You mentioned funding, but is there also manufacturing concerns? How fast can the U.S. replenish its supplies?
Well, some of the concerns I've heard is that in order to replace everything we've sent over already will take 10 to 12 years if we started right now. You can cut that significantly, but not only through the funding stream, but also by reactivating lines of manufacture that are not being used right now. That is a significant concern. If you look at, let's just say you've got a manufacturer able to make 155 millimeter artillery shells, and they've got two main lines of manufacturing. Well, they may have two others that are there to be used, but they're just not running due to material to supply to it, employees to run it, and the entire supply chain behind it. That's the problem. So we can wrap it up if we have the willpower we need to do it. The question will again come down to that willpower.
And on the note of willpower, what's your understanding of the U.S. military readiness if we are called into a shooting war?
Generally, I'm concerned about it, but not fearful of it, because the American soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine have shown throughout history their ability to adapt to any environment and overcome even the greatest odds. And sometimes it takes a while to get there, but that's just the reality of history. And I'm very confident in the majority of our military forces and their willingness to win on a battlefield if called upon to do so. Like I said, though, I am concerned about the political will, and some of that political will is in uniform too, wearing a lot of stars that just aren't ready for something like this and are not right for the job.
And historically, the Chinese Communist Party has said it wants the U.S. engaged in 4 overseas wars, one of which has to be a terror group. What's your understanding of what we're seeing right now unfolding?
Well, again, this for those of us who work in the foreign policy and strategy arena and have for years, we watch these things develop over time. We provide the best warning we possibly can of the scenarios that will likely develop. And for the last few years, specifically, we were able to see Afghanistan, and then we cautioned about the fact that Ukraine would probably blow up next, and then we talked about something was going to happen in the Middle East. And so far, I mean, sadly, and unfortunately, we're batting 1,000 within the people that I work with. So right now we're looking at, okay, does China start leaning in further on Taiwan?
Yep.
And there's a lot of reasons why they might do that. There are valid reasons why they might not and are not ready to do it. But it's one of those things that we should be looking at, because the only way for China to look at Taiwan and not worry about America specifically is to keep us busy elsewhere.
And what must the U.S. do now to ensure we don't see that kind of escalation?
Well, first of all, I'd like to remind Americans that the declaration of war on any foreign nation or entity belongs to the Congress, not to the President. And so those discussions need to happen with the representatives of we, the American people, and we own the risk and we own the decision on whether or not we want to engage in a conflict. That is not the right and duty of a president. The president's job is to command the forces when told to do so by the Congress. That's the first thing we have to do. And second of all is make sure that we secure our homeland first. Our southern border, we know, wide open. What does that mean? We don't know who's here in the United States. But it also means that if we can build a community defense group and just be there and be prepared if needed, and hopefully never are, then do that. But we got to start here at home, and then we can worry elsewhere.
Darren Gobb, thank you so much for your time.
In Egypt, Politis says Egypt won't want Hamas members sneaking into the country with the refugees, potentially strengthening the Muslim Brotherhood. But even if Egypt won't help, the refugees still have hope.
We will likely see some international effort to help civilian people who want to leave the Gaza area do so for safety. However, ultimately it depends on Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization not just towards Israel and the rest of the world, but towards its own people. They're the ones who prohibit their people from leaving.
Politis says because of this, the Gazan state is up in the air. Marlene Richards, NTD News.
What's the connection between Hamas and Iran, and has the U.S. added fuel to the fire? We spoke with Lee Smith, the author of The Strong Horse, Power Politics and the Clash of Arab Civilizations. He's also the host of Over the Target on Epic TV. Lee Smith, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you for inviting me on tonight, Tiffany.
To begin, we're hearing reports that Iran is behind this Israel-Hamas attack. What are we finding out about that?
Well, I mean, it was to be expected from the beginning that that's what was going on. I mean, that's how Hamas is armed, and that's how Hamas is trained, and that's how Hamas is supported. The White House was keen to obscure this bit of information for quite some time because the White House wants to partner with Iran. We've seen the sums of money that the White House has made available to Iran over the last several months. But of course, this goes back to the Obama administration when they made hundreds of billions of dollars available to the Islamic Republic of Iran. So we've known from the very beginning that Iran was involved in the operational planning. It was simply the White House wanted to hide this information because it's embarrassing to them.
And Lee, there's also reports that Hezbollah could be joining the fight against Israel. Hezbollah is more powerful than Hamas. How likely are we to see that, and how would that change the dynamic of the war?
Well, I mean, the Israelis have mobilized 300,000 reservists. So, of course, not all of them have been sent to the south. Some of them have been sent to the north in preparation for the possibility that Hezbollah might actually move on the north. We'll see what happens. It will depend. It will depend on what Israel does in the south and whether Iran decides to unleash Hezbollah as well. if Hamas is getting rolled up entirely in the south, and it really looks like they're in danger of that we may see the end of Hamas, then it wouldn't be surprising at all if Tehran unleashes Hezbollah too.
And Lee, you wrote a book on the power politics and clash of Arab civilizations titled "A Strong Horse." How do you understand this war? Why now?
Why now? Well, I see it right now because the Biden administration, this is the big thing about all the money that the Biden administration has made available to the Iranians. And it's not just that. The Biden administration wants to restore the nuclear deal. The Biden administration is signaling friendship with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So it's not just weakness. We hear many people saying, oh, the Biden administration is weak, Donald Trump is really strong. It's not just weakness. It's they're signaling friendship. They're signaling that they won't do anything about it, right? Because they don't want to interfere in future initiatives with the Islamic Republic. So, and insofar as the title is the strong horse, that's what it's really about, right? It's about who is going to set the order for the region. Iran is taking advantage of this and saying, okay, we're going to set the order of the region. It's never been about Iran versus Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and Israel are part of the American-led order of the region. It's the U.S. that directs how things are going in the region. When the U.S. turns around and says, well, I don't know, no more Israel, no more Saudi Arabia, we're going with the Iranians. That's what's happening. We're seeing that the United States has made an about-face, and the Iranians are taking advantage of this, and they're unleashing at least one of their terrorist outfits, Hamas. But as we discussed earlier, they may eventually unleash Hezbollah as well.
And given all that, what message should the U.S. be sending to ensure this doesn't escalate even more?
Well, they're not going to, unfortunately. I mean, what they've done is they've deployed they've deployed a carrier group in the Eastern Mediterranean, but that's not there to deter Hezbollah, or it's not there to support Israel. What the purpose of that is to help impose a ceasefire when the Biden administration and the international community wants to call an end to Israel's counter against Hamas. The Biden administration will impose that, and the carrier group is meant to defend that. The imposition of a ceasefire, right? It's not there in support of Israel.
And zooming